That dopamine depletion is going to make you want to eat something like sugar, because it's pretty much as soon as sugar touches your tongue, bam, we got some dopamine. Let's dive into part 2 on how we are going to address our low or high dopamine. So if you refer back to part 1, we discuss what is dopamine and what are some of the symptoms of high or low dopamine. So if you haven't already done that, make sure to take a look at that, because it will help you better assess what to do moving forward to address your situation. Mentioned previously, gut health is huge. Gut health is everything. And this is something that no matter the situation, you're going to want to address gut health. But in terms of actual dopamine production or achieving optimal dopamine, we're going to want to take a look at the gut health. How do we do that? Is we start by investing into a GI map. A GI map is a comprehensive stool test that will tell you exactly where your intestinal markers are at. It will tell you where your normal commensal flora is at, so your healthy microbiome. It will indicate any overgrowth, any viruses, pathogens, bacteria. Pretty well thought out test. And that is a wonderful way to address what is potentially going on that is leading to these symptoms that you're experiencing. So once you have defined what exact gut issue you are dealing with, then you can begin working on that. But with that being said, the dopamine is a symptom, whether it's high or low, and the gut health is the root cause. It does not mean you cannot address symptoms of low or high dopamine while addressing the root cause in terms of the gut health. This will help expedite the whole process, making it much more effective as well. This is where you're going to really want to seek out professional help. I myself am well versed in GI maps and working with gut cases. It's pretty much all I do now, because we are in a society where I mentioned in the previous part, everyone has a gut issue unless proven otherwise. And by working on those gut issues, not only are we going to help build optimal dopamine, but we are also going to improve our stress management, because having healthy guts means we are going to flush stress hormones as we should. We're going to have optimal dopamine, so we're not going to get angry. We're going to be in a more zen state. Our adrenals are going to work better. We're going to have less neuroinflammation and all around just lower levels of inflammation. You're just going to be an improved human being, and you're going to feel your absolute best when you are addressing that gut health. In the meantime, to practice stress management, that is where we'll use things like meditation, like walking, getting out in nature, hitting the mountains, going for a bike ride. Whatever you find really calms you down, make sure to practice that a lot. Even if it's journaling, something along the lines of that, because this is going to help not only nourish the adrenals by using less cortisol, but it's also going to decrease inflammation. As mentioned in the previous video, high levels of adrenaline, 50% of that will go through the gut and can feed up to 10,000% more bacteria, especially those bad bugs, which we really don't want happening. So by keeping your cortisol levels lower, keeping your adrenaline down, by practicing stress management, you're not going to be feeding into those underlying gut health conditions that are giving you the symptoms of high or low dopamine. Optimizing hormones. Once again, addressing that gut health is going to help us build optimal hormones, flush optimal hormones, especially estrogen and androgens, because those are big ones that tend to build up in people, mainly women, causing things like higher amounts of inflammation and can actually chronically lead to low dopamine. But as we discussed, higher estrogen will actually acutely lead to high dopamine due to the slow COMT gene keeping that dopamine in the brain. So by optimizing your hormones, we're going to have healthy levels of testosterone. You have adequate amount of flushing, but you're also going to have healthy levels of estrogen to keep that dopamine within the brain. If you are someone who is running performance enhancing drugs, because I commented on how that can greatly impact your dopamine in a negative sense, that is where that anger comes from, because you are simply just trying to build dopamine. This is where you may want to look at lowering your dosage of testosterone, or make sure you are building optimal estrogen and that you're not just blocking it all using aromatase inhibitors and such. Estrogen is important even in men. So if you're someone who deals with these anger issues and you are someone who uses high levels of testosterone, have your labs checked, see where you're at, and make sure to bring those levels down to optimal levels that you can manage so you don't experience something like low dopamine. So then we're going to want to avoid screens before bed and have a proper nighttime routine. So most of us know now that your phone, your computer, your TV, they emit something called blue light. And what this blue light is going to do is it's going to suppress the production of melatonin. And we want melatonin because that not only is going to give us a better sleep, but it's going to cause us to use less cortisol the next day. And this is going to help with building that dopamine and making less adrenaline. So making sure that you have a proper nighttime routine and you are staying off your phone will ensure that you're going to build optimal melatonin levels and get a really good sleep and be less stressed the next day. It's also going to help with insulin sensitivity, which is going to decrease overall inflammation, which will also lower neuroinflammation. And to add to that, to get even more melatonin production at night, getting sunlight first thing in the morning. Now, I understand not all of us have that opportunity to do that. So this is where I recommend something like a wake-up light. I myself personally use one because I get up before sun. At least in the summer months, it's kind of getting there, but 5 a.m. it's still pretty dark. So I'll use a wake-up light, but as soon as that sun begins to rise, I get out and I walk my girls and I get that in. And I've mentioned before that I believe your wake-up routine is almost more important than your nighttime routine because that's going to set your circadian rhythm, which is going to affect your glucose rhythm and how much melatonin you produce at night, improving your overall sleep quality, helping you build more dopamine the next day. And then let's look at increasing our protein intake. That is a big problem in today's society. We do not get enough protein. Many of us think we are getting a lot of protein, but we're kind of counting the protein from like trace sources such as nuts and whatnot, but those are not complete proteins. We want to get more like chicken, beef, fish, things along that nature to help increase our protein intake because protein is the building blocks for things like your neurotransmitters. So higher levels of protein mean more fuel to build these neurotransmitters, helping you increase your dopamine. And on top of increasing your protein intake, we want to eat more frequently. There's a lot of information and debate going around about fasting and such, which yes, fasting does have its benefits, but in the instance of someone that has low dopamine, especially if they have poor liver health and poor blood sugar regulation, you definitely want to eat more frequently. Because every time your blood sugar dips, you have to use stress hormones to bring that up, which then can deplete your dopamine. And this is where the cravings can come from because that dopamine depletion is going to make you want to eat something like sugar because it's pretty much as soon as sugar touches your tongue, bam, we got some dopamine. So this is why more frequent eating is important for maintaining dopamine levels. And with more food comes more nutrients and looking at some that we could potentially supplement if you are on the end of low dopamine. Nutrient number one, we're looking at mecanoperines. This is L-DOPA, so this is pretty much dopamine. So once again, though, always consult your professional because as mentioned in the previous video, when we were talking about receptor downregulation, you don't want to just take a bunch of dopamine in hopes it's going to greatly improve your life because you could have that negative feedback where those receptors begin to downregulate and then you're left with no dopamine and you're trying to pop more stuff and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Or you take too much and then you convert it to adrenaline, you get very anxious and you overmethylate and that just doesn't feel good. The mecanoperines is also known as the velvet bean. And then we're looking at L-phenylalanine and L-tyrosine. So these are once again found in protein. These are the building blocks for dopamine. But what I will say is when you take mecanoperines, that is going to make you build dopamine. When you take L-phenylalanine and L-tyrosine, they don't just automatically like force dopamine production. If you don't have a demand for it, they're just going to act as like fuel reserves. And then once there is that demand for dopamine, then you're able to build it because you have the necessary substrate. So if you're someone on the high end of dopamine, you don't need to be afraid to eat protein or take these, for example, because you're not just going to automatically build dopamine. Would I recommend taking extra if you're high dopamine? No, but don't be afraid of protein. And so now the big kickers here, which I maybe should have put in the front, is 5-MTHF and methyl B12. So that's your 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate and your methylcobalamin B12. These are important methyl donors that really get your system going. I describe them as nitrous for your vehicle. Methyl tetrahydrofolate is essentially what starts your engine. So if you don't have enough substrate of that, you're not going to be really turning your engine over. And then you're going to have poor dopamine production along with several other health issues due to poor methylation. So by ingesting extra 5-MTHF with methyl B12, because you want them in the right ratio, because as you increase that, you'll deplete B12. So then you'll skew the ratio and you won't actually methylate properly. AOR, Advanced Orthomolecular Research, they actually make a really good one. I found that's a great ratio of 5-MTHF to methyl B12 for improving dopamine production and just overall methylation within the body. You could also do a B complex that contains 5-MTHF and methyl B12, but the thing is you won't want to do more of that B complex to increase those numbers because then you'll get too many of the other B vitamins which could disrupt the methylation process, especially if you are someone who is unsure where they're at if they are high or low dopamine. So I recommend a minor B complex and adding more 5-MTHF and methyl B12 on top of that. And then we can look at St. John's wort. So this one is actually known to help uptake all the neurotransmitters. And I believe this is kind of like a timing thing. So by taking St. John worts, if there's a demand for dopamine, it's going to help uptake more dopamine. If there's a demand for serotonin, it's going to help uptake more serotonin. And then we can look at cordyceps or just adaptogens in general. So things like ginseng and Rhodiola rosea, things along that nature. These will help. They actually act in the brain, not at the level of the adrenals like most people think. And this will overall help not only with stress management, management, but also help with building dopamine. Then we got caffeine down here. Now, a lot of people know how I feel about caffeine, and I recommend if you've already been abusing caffeine to not use it to try to increase your dopamine because it won't have that effect. One of the reasons I don't like caffeine is because a lot of people get addicted to it and they rely on it, but also it's some of the most pesticide-filled thing on the planet, and it can also contain a lot of mold. And a lot of us are dealing with mold exposure and these mycotoxins which wreak havoc and will completely disrupt this entire system. So if you're going to use caffeine, use a cyclical approach. If you've already been using it frequently, take a break from it so you can get the effects from it, and make sure to get high quality caffeine. And then I threw inositol in here. Most people are familiar with inositol in terms of like polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's because it does help flush out androgens, which exacerbate polycystic ovarian syndrome symptoms. But in this instance, inositol can help restore neurotransmitter receptors, helping you improve that dopamine uptake. So there's lots we could do to help improve dopamine, but these are some of the heavy hitters. And once again, I have to say this, please consult your professional. Don't just blindly take these. Make sure that you fit the symptoms accordingly and have someone help guide you through this. And if you are unsure, if you are on high or low, especially if your only symptoms are like poor memory and brain fog, if you take something like mucanaprines, you're gonna feel worse. You're gonna end up on that list of the high dopamine symptoms where you may hallucinate or have anxiety and panic and worry. So then you know, okay, I'm more on the high dopamine side, so then you need to address that, which we'll get into. So going on to addressing high dopamine. So once again, we're going to come back to gut health because we have to look at what is the gut causing? Is it causing us to have more estrogen, which is then keeping dopamine in the brain longer, also resulting in poor catecholamine clearance, so poor dopamine clearance. And once again, this comes back to women because not only biologically do they have higher estrogen, but women are also more prone to higher estrogen due to like beauty products and such, and definitely birth control. More so after they've removed birth control because of what it can cause on the guts, the thyroid, and how you can have an androgen rebound. So then you're pouring all those androgens into estrogen, causing high estrogen, slowing that COMT down, making you anxious all the time, and putting you on the high end of dopamine. So once again, this is where something like endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome would probably fit into the category of high dopamine. And then on the opposite spectrum, you could look at menopause. Most menopausal women will fit into the category of low dopamine due to adrenal fatigue and having no estrogen, speeding up that COMT gene and flushing it all out. This is why we see depression is quite high in menopausal women, but that does not mean they will not be on the high side. I have actually a few clients of mine who are menopausal and they're actually on the high dopamine side. And these are usually the ones with immune problems. So once again, this is why we address the gut health. We make sure that is functioning optimally, and that will help with clearing out hormones or any of the other aspects that could be causing that dopamine to be sticking around. And stress management, once again, overall, that's going to improve things like gut health. It's going to optimize hormones. It's going to help flush hormones, all those things along that nature to help lower that dopamine to a more healthy, optimal level. And once again, to optimizing hormones, making sure you have adequate testosterone and that your estrogen is not too high, ensuring that you have optimal dopamine. And then so making our way into nutrients, we're gonna look at melatonin. Melatonin is a heavy hitter for things like high dopamine, and that's because it's going to lower cortisol levels and it's gonna lower the overall overproduction of dopamine. So remember, consult a professional, but if you have someone who is actually high in dopamine, they can do melatonin every waking hour to help lower those levels, and it'll reduce their anxiety, their worriness, and even their hallucinations. But you can also still do a good amount before bed. And that whole, you're gonna stop producing your own melatonin by supplementing melatonin is a total myth. There is no evidence proving that's what actually occurs. And with that being said too, if you're low in dopamine, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take melatonin. I still highly recommend taking melatonin before bed if you are low in dopamine, because then that's going to lower cortisol levels the next day, helping you produce more dopamine. And then we can look at 5-HTP because, as mentioned, dopamine and serotonin have an inverse relationship, so more serotonin will help lower levels of dopamine, along with skullcap because skullcap actually contains melatonin and serotonin. You got a double whammy right there. And then going into L-theanine, L-theanine helps produce GABA, your gamma-aminobutyric acid, so your calming neurotransmitter will also help produce serotonin, lowering your levels of dopamine, also decreasing neuroinflammation within the brain and lowering stress hormones. And then taurine is a really good one because taurine is known to calm the central nervous system down. So really anything that's going to calm you down can help lower these levels of dopamine. It's also really good for balancing electrolytes, and it's a powerful antioxidant. Things like Red Bull gave it a bad name. They put taurine in there so you don't get all jittery and whatnot. It does not make it bad. It's probably a poor quality form of taurine, but taurine is a very underrated amino acid, and I highly recommend that if you are someone who struggles with high dopamine to take higher levels of taurine. And once again, if you are somebody who's low on dopamine, you can still take taurine, just time it before bed. And then going into niacinamide. So niacinamide is B3, a form of B3, because you'll also look at niacin as a form of B3. But we want the niacinamide form because that is going to help reduce catecholamines and dopamine within the brain. So this is one that you could take throughout the day, but even if you're low in dopamine, you can take this before bed as well. Once again, we don't have to worry about that because we want low dopamine before bed. So then EGCG, which is your green tea extract, that also contains theanine, so we'll have the same mechanism. So that's a great one that you can use as well. And then CBD oil, as I referred in part one, this will totally just decrease dopamine. So this is a great way. You could take this hourly throughout the day to help decrease those dopamine levels. And then magnesium threonate. Threonate is more bioavailable to the brain, research says. And so this will decrease that neuroinflammation and also help clear out those catecholamines from the brain, bringing you to a more optimal level of dopamine. And just to say it one more time, if you have low dopamine, you can still take these. It's just a matter of timing. So all of this kind of stuff would be timed before bed. For example, if you have symptoms of like low serotonin, for example. But something like green tea, you could drink all day kind of thing. It does help with digestion. It helps with you calming. It's not going to like drastically reduce your dopamine if you are low dopamine. It's not the make or break. Otherwise, this stuff is just mainly timing before bed if you are someone who's low in dopamine. And there you have it. So that's the dopamine series there. I hope you guys enjoyed this. There's lots of information around dopamine. It's quite a nuanced subject, especially because gut health is so heavily involved. And as mentioned previously, there's so much misconstrued information on the internet about this. So hopefully this short series has cleared a little bit of things up, but I'm sure there are still some more questions. So please don't hesitate. Drop them in the comments. Send me a DM. I really appreciate your guys' feedback. It helps me provide better information for you because, you know, I love making this stuff and I love helping people. So the more I understand where you guys are coming from, the better I can make my content for you. And hopefully you find a lot of this useful. And if you are on either one of those spectrums, that you can implement some of these strategies to improve your overall quality of life. Because we all know how good it feels to receive dopamine. So if you guys like that video, please hit the like and subscribe button and follow me on Instagram at that.coach.curtis.